Tell me about your father, John.
Well, I guess it's my father's involvement in photography that is of interest there. And that started a long way back. He was brought up on an orchard out of Launceston, and at that stage, schooling, so on, was pretty rough and ready. And he had by marriage a cousin, fairly well known within photography, called John Beatty. And somehow this Scots, now Australian photographer, caught my father's imagination. And he started to take then young Jack out on photographic assignments. And one of the first was an assignment set up by the Tasmanian government to produce photographs for a set of postage stamps. This is pre-Federation, when each state ran their own stamp issues. And they were to be photographs of the Australian landscape. They were, incidentally, the first time ever in the world that photographs were used on a postage stamp issue. Some of the photographs, I understand, were taken by Steve Sperling, most of them by John Beatty. But on one occasion, Beatty took young 7-year-old Jack up into the Cradle Mountain area in Tassie. And at this stage, the boy had got a fair grasp of setting up the camera and exposing and so on. And he actually was allowed by Beatty to expose one of the plates. And that became the 5-penny stamp in the issue. Now, I don't know how accurate that story is, because my father had a wonderful gift with the longbow, but virtually his first photograph was taken at the age of 7 and published. It may also account for the fact that he was, all his life, a very, very keen philatelist. So that was the beginning, I think, of photography within the family. Later on, my father, at the age of 12, was apprenticed to Percy Whitelaw, I think it was, in Launceston. He had his own studio in Hobart by the time he was 17. Went to England, worked there 5 years as a stage photographer, theatre photographer. Then to Africa as a ethnographic photographer, really, working with a Professor Corey from Grahamstown University. Got his fellowship with the Royal Society at that stage. The Royal Society was possibly a much more prestigious organisation than it is today. And my father presented a body of work plus a thesis on the problems of tropical photography to the Society, for which he got his fellowship. I understand it was the first fellowship to the Royal Society ever gained by an Australian. Interesting that later on I would work very closely with the man, Athol Smith, who was the youngest ever member of the Royal Society. He got his fellowship at the age of 17, and I think they changed the rules afterwards so that it couldn't happen again. After the African stint, because of illness, and this was then immediately post-World War I, he returned to Tasmania, needed the cooler climate. He'd had malaria, blackwater fever, and a few other problems. Met my mother, married, and then went into the commercial area of photography. Commercial in the sense that it operated in those days as wedding portraiture, that sort of thing. Almost no pure commercial photography as we understand it today in the advertising area was done as early as that. I think it more or less had its beginnings late 20s. My father realised in the 20s that with portraiture and so on, you didn't need really to be in the smallest state in Australia. You didn't need a very small city-town situation. And thought, well, okay, I'll go to the biggest one. I'll go to Sydney. And he went up to scout the ground there in 1928. Went up in January, hit a typical Sydney summer January. That actually did upset him again physically, brought on some of the African problems again. Thought, well, no, that's not for me. Came down to Melbourne. It was a nice mild February by then, and that was then the move. He continued as a Melbourne photographer until immediately post-World War II. Retired from that in '46 as a photographer, although he still continued photographing. He had at that stage published his autobiography, and although he'd never had any formal literary training, the book was successful, and he felt that, well, maybe he could put that talent along with an historical interest in photography, and he virtually financed over the next 5 years his research project through selling off his stamp collection. So the stamps kept on that little link all the way through. And of course stamps very largely are about pictures.
What were your feelings about your father? How did you get on with him?
Well, I think that I probably had the most complex relationship anyone could have with another human being with my father. I guess every son goes through a variety of emotional relationships with a father, and in a sense, during my very early years, he was a very authoritarian, a very much respected, but to a certain extent feared figure. Then, when I started a part-time apprenticeship with him at the age of 12, that authoritarian father figure also became a teacher, so there was another totally different relationship. After that, of course, there were the normal problems, I think that, again, every teenage son goes through, with a rejection of that authority. And I guess in a way we became almost mortal enemies at that stage, and I can remember some very strong arguments between us of literally shaking fists, although never coming actually to blows. So that we went through that stage, and then as I got further involved in the profession of photography, which I followed, he became a very, very close friend, and more than that, almost a bigger brother who was teaching by example rather than teaching by rote. Then he also became a critic, and he was a ruthless critic. I never once got him to the stage of saying that was right. It was always, that's very good, but. And there was always that adverse criticism. I now am very thankful for that, because it did goad me into more effort all the time. In the later years of his life, I guess, in spite of friends of my own age peer group, he became more of a friend than they did. And in fact, we used to have dinner at least once a week together, just the two of us, usually at his club. We would have too much to drink together and so on. And it was a very healthy and very lovely relationship. Then ultimately, in the last 12 months of his life, when he lost his sight, in a sense, he certainly never adjusted to blindness, being a very visual person. And he, in a sense, became my son, so that we went through an entire cycle together. It was a very rich relationship. I still can get fairly emotional about those relationships, but it just went through the lot. I don't think I could have had a better teacher. In some regards, I think I could have had possibly a gentler father. There was never violence. I don't think he ever actually smacked my bum. It wasn't that sort of parental sternness. He seemed to be able to get that reaction simply verbally, often to my regret. But when you go through a cycle like that with somebody, obviously they take up a very large part of your life. And certainly even now, I guess in a sense, I'm trying to make him say, yes, John, that's good. It's a curious twist. I know he can't say it, but it has been a goad. I wouldn't like to do it as a teacher to my own students because I think it is a very severe goad, but in a sense maybe it's the right one.
Your own first steps into photography?
My own first steps into photography were around the age of 12. My age tells you that I grew up during the Depression, so-called Great. I think that my observations during that period have been a major influence on my outlook. It may be hard to find, but I think it's there politically and in many other aspects. And although I don't believe that Jack ever wanted me to follow photography, I think when I got to the age of 12, I can remember quite distinctly, he gave me my sixpence pocket money on the Saturday morning and said, well, that's the last free one. From now on, you earn it. And that was the end of Saturdays as far as I was concerned. From then on, Saturday, I worked 12 hours a day, 8 in the morning till 8 at night, carting lights around to weddings, loading slides, setting apertures on cameras and that sort of thing. And I think that mainly his view there was that no matter what I did, school did not teach me to work. School taught me to study, but study in itself did not earn any money. It may be the means of earning money, but you had to learn to put in a day's work. And I think that his idea there was purely to teach me the discipline of doing a day's work. So that in a sense was my introduction into photography. He did at the same time give me a folding Kodak autographic camera. It took 6x4 film, I think it was, a 6x4 roll film, size 118, I can remember. And I suddenly found myself, because I had money by working, I was paid and paid quite well. I think my average income was about 10 shillings a week. That was working school holidays as well. But I was able to buy myself a push bike, get off into the country with a camera and take photographs, and I loved it. Most people, it's an interesting one that when I talk to students now and ask them, what was the first photograph you took? 99% of them, when they're first given a camera, photograph their friends and family. It's people photographs. And I find it interesting, the first photographs I took were of landscape. I obviously spent a commercial life of some 30-odd years photographing people, but the moment I was able to move out of that into my own thing, it was back to landscape. So you really go back to where you started. You go back to the roots that are the strongest. On my, 16th birthday, I think, he gave me a second-hand Thornton Pickard half-plate camera. And at that stage, I thought I was a photographer. Certainly when I came back from Navy years, he had retired. I had been working at his studio for the 12 months between end of school and beginning of Navy. And there was no job for me to come back to, so for the first 18 months, 2 years after the Navy, I was photographing weddings from home, utilising his darkroom and so on. And that was pretty disastrous, but it was disastrous financially. I certainly lost more money than I made. Living at home made things easier financially. But it was at that stage, I think I was 20 or 21. I received a phone call from the Argus newspaper that then operated in Melbourne. They had a 5 magazine group. and they rang and said, hey, you know, would you like a job? Somehow I've been lucky like that. People have offered me work rather than made me chase it. And that then was my real professional beginning, was 3 years as a photojournalist.
At that stage, was photography something you were interested in, loved, liked? Or was it just because your father was a photographer that you moved into it?
I think all of those things. I think I moved into photography very comfortably because I cannot remember any stage of my early years where I was not surrounded by photographs. There were always photographs around the house. Now that goes long way before my conscious beginnings of it. Certainly I was looking at photographs when I was 4 years of age, maybe 3 years of age. I just don't recall that far back. But I know that when I went to work at the studio, helping out on weddings and so on, there was a certain amount of darkroom time. And one of the biggest things I remember was just the smell of it, the smell of that acetic acid, and a lot of glass plates were still being used then, and the glass plates they had their own smell, and they had their own wrapping paper, and they had their own look, and there was just, I guess, a little bit of that sense of magic, because photography today, everybody does. I'm talking about the late 30s, just pre-World War II, and not only did everybody not do it, but certainly if you did it professionally, you were strange. You had to be strange. Nobody did photography for a living. I can remember being at school and kids saying to me, what does your father do? And I would say, he's a photographer. And their immediate reaction was that he stood outside the Hotel Australia with a Leica and handed out cards of people walking down the street. That was the only sort of photography that people really saw or knew about. I guess amateur photography was fairly strong, but it was also fairly restricted. It was a rich man's hobby, and I'm talking about a depression period when there weren't many rich men about. Even today, to be a hobbyist photographer is a fairly costly process, but because we're a more affluent society than a depression period, we can afford that sort of luxury.
Tell me about your Argus days.
Oh, Argus days were fun. The Argus was a very old newspaper in Melbourne. I have an idea it may have been the first newspaper that ever opened in Melbourne. And it ran 5 magazines. If I tell you the subject titles, it'll give you an idea of the diversity. There was Farm and Home, which was a magazine, a sort of stock and station magazine produced for the man on the land. That was a monthly. There was Australasian Post, which still exists. It was taken over by the Herald. It was a very different magazine then in the 40s, late 40s I'm talking, to now the early 80s. It was much more Australasian in content. New Zealand was very much included. They also included New Guinea. And it was a story people magazine, much more than the sort of girly thing that it has turned into. Then there was another magazine, Your Garden. That was a monthly. Post was a weekly. Your Garden was a monthly. That is still run by Herald Sun, purely a gardener's magazine. Woman's World, which was a housewife-oriented magazine of knitting, cooking, exercises, you know, all of that sort of range that you find in those women's magazines. And a magazine called Fashion, which was, again, for a younger, wealthier group of women, was very specifically a fashion magazine. Now, I was working on each of those magazines every week, so I could be photographing a stud bull on Monday morning, a group of models in the latest sportswear in the afternoon, on the Tuesday photographing whatever happened to be in season and flowering at the Botanical Gardens for Your Garden, and the very next day going up to the home of a very charming woman who used to do the cookery and photographing hot dishes in her home up near Olinda and having to eat most of them and drink the wines that went with them and so on. And it was just that continual churn of things that really worked for me very well as a learning experience. The basic problem was the Australasian Post side, where with a journalist, a guy by the name of Ron Testro, I used to have to travel interstate quite a lot. And you would go, for instance, to Queensland for 6 weeks and stockpile enough Queensland stories. They should never be topical. They had to be an ongoing story, not just simply a news story. But you'd stockpile Queensland stories for the next maybe 8 or 9 months in that 6-week period. You'd then come back to base and have to go perhaps across to Western Australia and stockpile Western Australian stories, or across to New Zealand. And that I found was the basic problem, because during the 3 years I was with them, I married. And in the first year of married life, I was away so much, literally going to work in the morning, expecting to be home of an evening, and not coming back for a week, just having time enough to make a quick phone call and say, hey, you know, I've got the toothbrush and we're off. And I realised that whilst that was a wonderful life and a wonderful way of working, that ultimately it did not fit in with something that at that stage of my life I really wanted to work, and that was a married life. And I guess I was looking for a way out of that when I went for Post to cover a fashion show at Stan Hill Building in Queen's Road. I can remember it was a hole-proof fashion show, and Athol Smith was there covering the show for hole-proof. And apparently he was watching me work, and at the end of the evening I was just about to head off back to office, and he said, oh, John, can I see you for a minute before you go? And we chatted. He said, look, I've been watching the way you work. I want an assistant photographer. Are you interested? And I think I gave the required 1 month's notice to the Argus, and at the end of that month started with Athol, which then became a 25-year association.
You left the Argus. Oops, microphone. We're talking about your involvement with Athol. Can you describe some of those early days working with Athol? Did you know him at that stage?
I had met him very, very briefly just before then. It was at one stage the Australasian Post was running a feature column, feature page each week called Men of the Moment. And it was almost a sort of time-life profile, written even within that style. And it covered designers, artists, people who were generally in the public eye, and was always accompanied by a photograph of them. And I was the guy who used to have to go and take the photograph, because I was virtually staff photographer. At one occasion they did a story on Athol Smith. Now, Athol Smith at that stage was the major figure in Melbourne photography, and I was totally overawed going along to this maestro of the camera to do my humble efforts. And I must admit he was very, very gracious, made me feel totally at home. And I got my shots, went back to the Argus, processed the film. There was one problem. I had been so overawed that I'd totally forgotten to focus the camera. So I had well exposed but very, very fuzzy images of Athol. And of course I then had to face up to the very embarrassing humiliation of phoning him, explaining what had happened, and asked if I could go back for a reshoot. And it is characteristic of the Athol that I still am very friendly with, whom I joined in 1950, and this was 1949, it was the year before, that he just took me back up to the studio, said, you know, I'll do whatever you want, take your time, relax, and he almost coaxed me through that portrait of him, which, as I remember, was a pretty bloody good shot of him too. And no, that was my first meeting with Athol. Then my second meeting happened, as I say, at, I remember it quite well, Stan Hill down in Queens Road, Melbourne, up on the penthouse area. And 1 month later I joined him. Well, I don't know, today photographers within the professional area seem to divide between, you know, they are wedding portrait photographers, or they are architectural, or they are industrial. Athol simply described himself as an illustrative photographer, and that is what we were for the 25 years we were together. If a client came up with something they wanted photographed, we photographed it. It was as simple as that. I know today students want me to apologise for my immorality in photographing motor cars, because motor car companies, we know, are terribly corrupt and immoral, and behind all sorts of nasty dealings. Equally, if we hadn't, because I really do see a commercial photographer basically as a salesman. Instead of standing behind a counter and using words, he is behind a camera and using images so that he is selling a product. If the product doesn't sell, you may say, well, that nasty company goes bust, but so do several thousand employees get out of work. I'm afraid that any society has problems. I totally accept those problems. I would like to think that in all that period, none of my work ever directly harmed anyone. I don't know. And I don't know that I can make those sorts of judgments even now. I know some commercial photographers today won't photograph cigarette ads. And in spite of the fact that I'm a pretty hefty smoker myself, I certainly don't want to encourage other people to take up something that I now know, not know then, is fairly injurious. I did do cigarette ads. I photographed motor cars. I photographed knives and forks. I photographed dresses. I photographed anything and everything. It included medical photography, and a lot of that was used, I think, for very positive reasons. I guess I might just as well have done that to support a family as to stand behind a counter in Myers and sell the same products by a different means. I don't really see all that much difference. And I think we can spend too much time apologising about our own actions. We live within a society, we live as best we can within it.
How did the scene change over the years that you were with Athol?
Well, the scene changed very directionally, further and further towards fashion. Certainly when I joined Athol in the 1950 period, there had just been an enormous boom in fashion, because in the war years immediately following the war, because there had been so many fashion restrictions during the war, lack of material, lack of ability to buy, because all clothing was on a ration card system. You could only buy so many pairs of shoes in so many years, this sort of thing. And I think the public were very, very tired of that restriction to their individual freedom. So that from about 1945, the end of 1945 through to 1950, there was a big boom in fashion. And it was very extravagant fashion, using a lot of material, because people had always had to wear things that were fairly tight-fitting prior to then, just simple yardage of fabric. That had quietened down at the beginning of the 50s, and I think it stayed fairly quiet again. It sort of settled off onto an even keel and really got going again around the 60s, early 60s, when fashion became once again, going back almost to 1920s, an art form in its own right. So in a sense, we were photographing an art form, and that became virtually the major part of the business. I think the last 10 years that I was in business, I almost did nothing but fashion. There was the occasional job, but it would only account for perhaps an hour a week or something on that sort of basis. And 40 hours of the week were literally photographing shoes and handbags and knitwear and dresses and everything.
Would you have termed that creative work, or was it fairly mundane?
It was a bit of both. Again, you really couldn't in those days be too choosy about it. And if it were Meyer's basement range, a sort of catalogue range, you accepted it and you did it to the best of your ability. If it was haute couture of Lil Whiteman or one of those major fashion houses, you did that also. You used the word creative in that sense. I would like to think that every photograph I took had an element of creativity in it. Certainly I know that starting any week at the studio, you did it with the determination that you were going to do it better than you did it last week. And I think that was part of the fun of it, of pushing yourself harder, making yourself your own competitor rather than trying to compete with another photographer.
Where did your ideas for photographs at that stage come from? I imagine you'd be trying to come up occasionally with new ideas, or...
Yeah, I think that because Australian fashion was always at least one season behind the Northern Hemisphere overseas, we were very influenced by the major fashion magazines of the time. Within the studio, I think I can safely say for both Athol and myself that Vogue was our Bible. And we were always looking to see what Parkinson or Penn or Avedon had done last season. And I guess they were our major influences. Obviously, again, you would always have a sort of Australian input, because it was no use simply aping the American or the English or the Italian.
Were you taking many photographs for yourself at that time?
I was doing as much as time allowed. I think if I say that from the age of 30 till the age of 35, my involvement in the studio was such that the only days I had off were Sundays, Good Friday, Christmas Day and New Year's Day. They were the only days of the year that I didn't work for a 5-year period. Now, when you've got that sort of output of work and input of effort, when you do have those days off, you certainly don't want to take photographs, even if they're for yourself, so that there would be a 5-year period between my age of 30 to 35, when no, I did not take one photograph for myself. As that eased off, because that was part of the competitive drive to become one of the best, and I think that ambition is fairly normal. But I think there comes the time when you are one of the best that you can afford to slack off a bit. And I then started to take much more extended holiday periods. The holiday periods were usually under canvas, in the bush, which I loved, which fortunately my family also shared that. And then I was just toting around a 35mm and shooting landscape, figures in landscape, if you put it in those terms, at that level. But it was never really satisfying. It took me a long time to realise that I had to do far more than simply point a camera at the landscape in the way that I would point a camera at a model in the latest evening gown in the studio.
Wasn't there some stage where you actually burned a whole lot of negatives?
1969, a period happened in my own life. It's one of those things that I think happens to everybody when you just hit a rock and realise that you have to reevaluate what you're doing, why you're doing it, where you're going, and those sorts of things. And in 1969, I realised that basically all the work that I had done, both professionally and non-professionally, my own personal work, was not really John Cato's photography. There were too many other visual influences at work. I'm a very strong believer in the non-visual influence for a visual artist. Music, literature, poetry, all of those sorts of things, including politics, whatever, economics. And in 1969 I realised that that other input, that really personal thing that was mine, was not existing in my work. So the easiest thing to do was to physically go through the catharsis of destroying it. So I simply put it in the incinerator and burnt it here. In many ways now, because I had no idea at that stage I was going to become a teacher, as a teacher, yes. I think it would be useful for me now to have that work in order to tear it to shreds for my students. Because I could tear it to shreds, and I think the learning process is partly a tearing to shreds of yourself, of your own work, not emotionally, to fully understand, you know, the negative aspects that are working there so that you can make better use of the positive aspects. And no, I quite often think, or discussing that with that student, I would like to have those images because I could then say what I was doing wrong and hopefully help them avoid those same spots. I haven't got the work, so no, I've just got to accept it. I don't regret, as the author of that work no longer exists. It was work that existed then, it had its time, it was time for it to be buried.
Why did you decide to leave that field and move into teaching?
It's linked also very much with that same period of 1969, because the one work that became a turning point for me started in 1969. During that self-examination or re-examination, it was a very internalised process. And I then, in 1969, started a project which finished in 1970. It took 12 months. And I knew that there was another direction. I also, somewhere in that year, realised that I no longer wanted to continue in the industry that I had worked for 25 years. I think there were several factors. I think there was a disillusionment with the world of advertising because it was, at that stage, becoming, I think, less moral. But also I found that a professional client wants you to solve a problem. And if 1,000 clients walk up your stairs 10,000 times a year for 25 years, they run out of new problems, which means that you are resolving the problem that you solved last year. Eventually it becomes dull, there's just no challenge left. And somewhere along the line, because I was then into my, well, certainly into my 40s, middle 40s, something happened where I thought, hey, I was taught, and I was very well taught. I have used that teaching. Perhaps that is finished for me. It is now up to me to pay my dues, whatever terms you care to put it in. It might simply just have been, okay, teaching now seems to be the logical end of that circle. And it took me some years to get in because you couldn't just knock off and go and get a job teaching photography. They were pretty limited positions. RMIT had a course going. That was the only one in Victoria. well, not quite. In 1969, the course had started at Paran, but in a very low-key area. It was teaching photography to graphic design students, not teaching photography per se, certainly not as an art form. My interest had always been in the art side, although I'd never practiced it. Not really, not professionally. And it took, I actually did get a part-time position at Paran in 1974. I was teaching there 2 days a week and working in the studio 3 days a week. Decided that yes, there was no way I was going to stay in the studio. Somehow I had to teach full-time. The opportunity happened in 1975. I was full-time at Paran in 75. Then in November 75, pretty fateful period, Whitlam had quite obviously got into a lot of trouble over the enormous amount of funding for the arts right through the Commonwealth. And they had to cut back, and I was notified in 75 that it was a case of last in, first out. They had to cut staff so that I wouldn't have a job in 76. So that Whitlam and I both found ourselves out of work in 76. For 6 months, I staggered along doing a few workshops, guest lectures at various places and so on. It was financially very unsatisfactory. I had to sit down at the end of 6 months and think very solidly of what I was going to do. Would I go back into the profession? Would I try and hang on for teaching? Or would I buy a milk bar and sell milk? My wife and I went out into the bush for a month, thought about it, came back determined that it was teaching I was going to hang out for. And I no sooner got back, literally the day after we arrived back home, the phone started ringing. And I just found I had more work thrown at me than I could possibly handle.
So what did you do then?
So then I virtually part-timed. I was doing some lectures per week at Paran. I was doing a lot of lectures per week at Photography Studies College. I was doing guest lectures over in Hobart, up in Darwin, wherever. It was purely a freelance thing. That was very good, but in a way that I felt it lacked a continuity of relationship with the student. And when Athol retired from Paran at the end of 79, they publicly advertised for a new head of department. I applied for it and got it. And certainly I've been very satisfied with it because it does provide that continuity. I meet a student coming in at first year level and I'm with that student until they move out at the end of third year. And I think it is a useful situation for them. I'm sure it's a very useful situation for me because there's an enormous amount of input that a teacher gets from the student. More of an ideas input because it does tend to be an emotion. It's an emotional minus at the end of the year, but I think an intellectual plus. Of course, physically solid work.
How was the move into teaching? What was their first teaching session like? Was it a sudden change or something you expected?
I think the thing that surprised me when I first went into teaching was how little students knew. I think when you have been doing a process for, certainly at that stage, it had been at least 35 years since I'd started. And things that I took for normal, things that you do when you're photographing without even looking at your hand just does it. You forget that somehow, somewhere along the line, you were taught to do that. And I think that was probably the biggest shock that I got in going into teaching was that the students actually knew nothing. So that you had to start right from kindergarten. I believe that still holds. That even with students that have done perhaps a 12-month basic photography course or a TOP course or something like that, they still have no real understanding of what they're doing. They know that if they put a film in the camera and point it there and do what the needle says and push the button, they'll get an image, but they don't understand what is happening in there. And I've discussed it with a few friends from time to time. I think perhaps there's almost even a need to go right back, as certainly quite a few schools did years ago, get the students to actually make pinhole cameras. Make your own camera. Maybe they should also coat their own film and dissolve their own silver in nitric acid, and right back so they really understand, and I mean understand rather than know, the full process, because they do know so very little. Now, what happens, or what tends to happen within that sort of context, is that the student will learn what he wants to know today. Now, when he's left you in 3 years' time, he may find a problem come up and suddenly dear old Teach isn't around to help out with that problem. And because they don't understand the basics, they can't see a way around it. Whereas the way around it's probably very simple.
Why do you think a lot of the students are actually taking up photography?
I think, Philip, it goes beyond that. It's not just why are so many people taking up photography. Why is it that, how many art schools are there in Melbourne at the moment? I think there are about 7. They're turning away applicants by the hundreds, so that it's photography and painting and drawing and sculpture. It's the whole range of the visual arts. I don't know about in the other arts. I would imagine the same sort of things happening in theatre, dance, drama, music and so on. And I do have a theory about it. I think it's that the young people in a growing population like Australia and other major countries in the world are going through an identity crisis. I don't think they know who they are within society, and the visual evidence of an art object tells them who they are. If I put it in the terms of, if I go back to being a 12-year-old schoolboy and coming home and my mother saying, "John, I want you to go down to Mr. Brown's and get me a pound of butter and half a pound of bacon." I would go down to Mr. Brown's, I would walk in and say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Brown, Mum wants." He would say, "Well, how is your mother, John, and how's your sister, and how's Dad getting along, and, did you play football at school last Friday," or whatever. There was a connection of me with the community that I lived in. I think to a certain extent we still have that in provincial centres. Maybe it still exists in the smaller country towns. I'm not talking about the really bigger ones like Ballarat and Hamilton and so on, although I don't know. But now, kid comes home from school, Mum wants some butter and some bacon, she gives him the money, he goes to Safeways, he helps himself to what he wants. He goes through a checkout point. He's never seen the girl who's there before in his life. She's never seen him. There is no relationship within the community. The only thing he can relate to is his own particular little group, his own peer group, gang, whatever. And even there, he is feeling part of a group rather than an individual, because the gang exists within the suburb, but he as an individual doesn't exist. He's not recognised except by the gang itself. And I don't know, perhaps I'm over-theorising it, but I do feel that young people today have got a quite severe identity crisis. I believe art is a way of solving it. I don't think it's the only way, but I think it's a way that is seen as a very positive outlet by younger people. Consequently, for the 20 places that Paran offered this year, 1986, we had 250 applicants, which means we've said no to 230 people. Now, some of them have got into other courses, but when you consider that if we go back 20 years ago in Melbourne, the only college you could study photography at was RMIT. There were no private schools, there were no Council of Adult Education courses, there were no little local community art places which taught photography. It was RMIT or an apprenticeship or nothing. Apprenticeships were few and far between. And RMIT in those days had a very low student number. I can't give you figures, but it was quite a low student number. Today, at tertiary level, I would suggest that there are probably 500 people, maybe 600 people, studying photography, tertiary level, in Victoria this year. If I might just elaborate on that, in America it's even greater, to the point of one college I know, the Orange Coast Community College, which is about 60 miles south of Los Angeles. They have, in any 1 year at the college, 1,300 students studying photography.
Has photography got anything going for it as far as you're concerned in relationship to painting or any other art form for those two?
Yeah. It's a curious thing that when you're asked to somehow justify yourself as a photography teacher, people invariably say, you know, what sort of work are your students going to get? And I think that's a bit arse up. I've never heard a sculpture teacher or a painting teacher asked, you know, what sort of employment their students get when they leave. Working within the fine arts is simply working within the fine arts. It's not going to guarantee that you're going to become a millionaire or even live more than very simply. But I do think if I look at photography in relationship to the other visual arts, I would come out with one probably thundering statement that the most socially influential medium in the arts today is photography. Every person in Australia understands photography. They understand new photography. They do not understand new painting, new sculpture, new music, even new theatre. They work very much to an elitist, educated group, and I don't say that nastily. Art generally does tend to be elitist by virtue of its very nature. Science is elitist. Sport is elitist. If you're no good at it, you're no good at it. That's all there is to it. But photography, I believe, is a power to record the past, to change the present and make a better future. I cannot, I don't think, point to an art medium that has produced the Lewis Hines, the Jacob Reeses, the Eugene Smiths, that have really made major social change. Now, I'm saying socially significant. I'm not saying artistically significant. But I would believe and I would argue that although they had never done it in any war before, I believe that the photographer, and by photographer I mean somebody who uses a lens, I don't care whether it's a video camera or cine camera or a still camera, I believe that because of the work of people working with lenses in Vietnam, the Vietnam War was shortened. Now, I say that is socially significant. I don't think any painter could have done it, and that's not a criticism of painting. So that, to me, is really photography's main strength, is a strength for social change.
With your teaching of photography in relationship with students, how close do you get to them?
You've got to be very careful with relationships with students. Bear in mind that as head of department, you may, if you start to get friendly with Fred, in 12 months' time, say, Fred, look, you're wasting your time, I'm failing you, get out, and it can be a pretty traumatic experience for the student, which in turn, if the teacher has any real empathy with his students, I think is pretty traumatic to the teacher. You know, nobody likes sacking anybody. I find that I have to watch relationships with students fairly carefully, that in first year I tried to be fairly standoffish. I don't want to get too close in first year. I want them to trust me. I want them to listen to what I'm saying with some sort of belief. I want them to question that, but I don't want them, although it's, first name terms immediately, I don't want them to have that sort of totally relaxed friends relationship. I think by the time third year comes round, then you can start to ease up, and if a student starts to move towards you or you start to move towards a student, just allow it to happen. I find that the most rewarding part happens later on. It happens a couple of years after they've finished being your students, and they then come back, and that to me is when any real relationship starts to develop. And sometimes it actually becomes a slight problem to, in any one week, have lunch with all the friends that ex-students have become. Some of them on quite a regular basis. There's one ex-student, and during the school teaching year, every second Tuesday we have lunch together. He's a man 15 years younger than myself. That I think is great. But I think during the actual teaching years there has to be a slight amount of reserve, because ultimately you are the boss. And whilst I think it can be a family relationship, it still becomes a father-son relationship. If you don't behave yourself, I'll put you over my knee and spank your backside.
What about the rewards for yourself in teaching?
It's a double-edged one. I find that through teaching in any one year, I see tens of thousands of photographs. And then when I have a few weeks off to do my own work, I just don't want to even think or see or talk about photographs. And it usually takes me a couple of weeks to even want to pick up a camera, so that there is a negative aspect to the production of my own work. By the same token, the ideas input from students is enormous. The challenges they put up are enormous, and you have to cope with them. And I don't know, I think generally it is a very positive thing. Obviously there's going to be some students that are difficult for you to react to. You have to try and overcome that. But I think that I am kept younger, kept more alert, kept more interested, if not more interesting, because I'm mixing with those young, inquiring minds. Yeah, I think teaching's a great thing to do. But I've always felt that any employment where you're giving, that is, any service job, is more satisfying than a job which is a non-service job.
How much of teaching photography for you is teaching f-stops and shutter speeds?
There is a certain amount of it. My approach with Paran students is that I will do all of that in the first 8 weeks that we're together. At the end of 8 weeks, it will only be mentioned in relationship to an aesthetic problem. I am fortunate in that I have a tutor demonstrator technician who, if there is a technical problem, the student goes to that person. But hopefully my relationship with the students is about ideas, emotions, intellect, all of that sort of area. Aesthetics.
How much influence in photography generally do you think the changes in the technical side has made? Going right back from daguerreotypes through to possibility now of electronic images.
Yeah. I don't know. If I look at photography purely at an aesthetic level, I can't see much that's very positive. I don't know that portrait photographers today, with all the automatic equipment they've got, are producing better portraits than Julia Margaret Cameron produced 100 years ago, or Bill Brandt produced 50 years ago. And that's just looking at portraits. I think that could be said right across the board. I think that electronically computer-originated imagery is exciting, but I think the excitement's fairly superficial. It's pretty much on the surface. If anything, I think that the developments in photography have called for greater rationalisation within the industry, which has led to less and less choices. It sort of gives you one thing with one hand and takes away three with another, so that I must admit to myself as a photographer, I feel much worse off than I did 30 years ago. 30 years ago I had more choices. You look inquiringly, just in the surface of the paper I use. 30 years ago I had the choice of 30 surfaces. Today I've got the choice of 2 or 3. Now that may seem a very minor point, but it runs right through the profession. Lenses are sharper today. I think that's a bit of a cult in itself. We don't see, none of us see with, 20/20 vision's good. A Hasselblad lens sees with 50/50 vision. Now that may be an advantage for a certain type of work, but it is not necessary. Again, mentioning Julia Margaret Cameron, she deliberately had aberrations ground into her lenses 100 years ago when they weren't too good anyway. To take away that clinical surface thing. If we talk about portraiture, I don't believe that, a portrait can show a person's soul, but I believe it can reflect something that is inner, an inner beauty perhaps, in a face that may not be externally beautiful. And then we went through a period in portraiture where it was warts and all. You certainly didn't do anything to flatter in any way your subject. Now it seems to me we've arrived to the point where you only photograph the warts. It's almost a desire to find an inner ugliness. I just find it rather suspect. I think it's a trendy-ism, and let's face it, all art goes through trendy-isms, but I think perhaps it goes overboard. I think we set up a lot of technical gods that aren't that high and mighty. They've still got clay feet.
Getting away from the teaching, can we talk about some of your own photographs and photograph series? Photos. I'd quite like some sort of maybe just background thoughts and some idea of where some of those pictures came from, where the ideas for the series came from.
Are we rolling?
Which were the first photographs that you took?
I don't know. Yeah, after the negative burning, after the 1969 thing, I knew that there was a possibility of me finding a photograph that was mine, sort of thing. I don't mean original, that sort of thing, but certainly that was my sort of image, that would be recognisably my sort of image. And although we've discussed it privately, I don't think it's on tape. That comment, that sort of second lesson in photography that my father gave me when I was about 14 years of age. If you would draw, practice. If you would be an artist, study the great poets, the great literature and the music of the masters. Now, that in turn had been handed on to him by a Belgian sculptor, Lucien de Chesneau, who was principal of fine art at Launceston Technical School, I think it was. And I suppose in 1980 terms, that sounds terribly elitist, and I think you've got to be fairly careful about saying, you know, what is the music of the masters? You know, who are the masters? Are the masters the contemporary new composers? Was a master musician Bob Dylan? So you have to study that right across its potential range. And certainly I think there is great literature being produced in the 1980s just as much as there was in the 1880s or 1780s. So you have to be very careful about that definition. But I've always had the feeling that although it's necessary to see an enormous amount of imagery, photographic, painting, drawing, prints, whatever, in order to understand the language of visual communication, I think it can be dangerous if you try to derive your own images from that source. You simply derive the language. Consequently, I have always tended to look much more at literature and music for the germ of those ideas. And in 1969, I can remember very distinctly being away in the bush with my wife, having complete works of Bill Shakespeare with me, and reading in As You Like It. It's Scene 1, Act 2. Very well known soliloquy, the Duke in the forest, saying, "And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. I would not change it." Somehow that just hit a chord at that time. I was in a pretty emotionally sensitized condition anyway. And I started to link it up to other literary figures coming up with similar ideas. A couplet of Blake's from Auguries of Innocence. We are led to believe a lie when we see with, not through the eye. Walt Whitman saying the same thing, all truths await in all things, they do not need the obstetric forceps of the surgeon. I started to think that, well, the things that I really wanted to do, I think were about two things. I wanted to derive a language about people from the landscape, so that I was going to photograph the landscape, but the photographs would be about people, rather than photographing perhaps people and talking about the landscape. And that was the beginning of a project that lasted the 12 months from 69 to 70. It was a self-inflicted masochistic wound of working every weekend, every moment I could get away from the studio at it, doing it very simply and gradually watching what was coming out of that work. That work, funnily enough, the thing called Earth Song that came out of it is still today probably the most popular thing that I did, although I see it purely as a transition from what was to then finding out where to go. And I followed it up with two major essays that actually took 13 years total to produce 150 photographs, in which I think I'm using the landscape to question several things. The first essay, Essay 1, would be landscapes in a figure rather than the other way around. I was looking at the Australian landscape, specifically Australian, trying to say something about the Australian landscape, its vastness, all of those sorts of things, but looking at a landscape also that is within all men, that archetypal landscape that Jung speaks about. And for me, that whole work, that consisted of 80 photographs, is about the archetype. It's related to Greek mythology, which is a hobby of mine, to Christian mythology, Jewish mythology, a whole lot. It just digs into itself. I'd be the first to admit that possibly very few people have read that in the work, but it is there. Now, maybe it'll be better read in another 10 years. I don't know. I know that Gail Newton, whom I respect very much in Australian photography, was curator at the New South Wales Art Gallery. She maintains that my work has two lives, one on its own and one that is totally different when I am present, so that there's some sort of interesting thing going on there. Then during the production of that work, I realised that whilst I was about Australia and this universal internal landscape of man, obviously very much my own as well, I realised there was something else relating to the Australian landscape that I hadn't touched upon, and that was the difference of being a black man or a white man in that internalised landscape. So that became Essay 2, which was Figures in a Landscape. The words now reversed around to their normal way. And again, I think I'm talking about a destruction of a culture. Certainly, obviously, land's right issue is in there. But it's basically about that conflict between the nomad and the farmer, because those I see as the two major differences that have caused all of this problem. There is always, with all of those essays, and when I say all, the two essays, each of them contains 5 parts, although in Essay 2, 2 of those parts are simply a prologue and an epilogue. I have been very careful to weave 5 themes into each. And I will talk about any 3 themes, but I will not talk about the final 2. It seems to me that artists don't like a work to speak explicitly. They feel that it must have ambiguity, so I've deliberately put the ambiguity in, and if they want to know what it is, then they've got to work it out, because I won't talk about it.
Hold on, we've got your maybe. That's the whole carpet.
So you mentioned 2 essays. What's happened since then?
Well, the 2 essays, certainly the second one, the Earth Song, if we go right back to the 69-70, was very political. It was anti-nuclear device. Essay 1 was more a psychological work. Essay 2 again became very political. Because in a sense I'm a conservationist, I wanted to make some public comment about the destruction of our forests. At the time that Dr. Richardson Barb Baker died, the man of the trees, I thought I'd like to dedicate something to the work of that very wonderful guy. And I decided to make a visual comment about destruction of forest. And I set out to, over a couple of years, to photograph simply dead trees or parts of dead trees and make some statement. And last year, early last year, I actually did the final work prints of that work and realised that what I had done was to produce rather beautiful pictures. Now, producing beautiful pictures is pretty easy. Producing pictures that say something, I think is fairly difficult, and I realised that those 2 years had virtually been wasted because I had not achieved what I set out to do. Now, I hadn't been wasted totally, but I had been defeated by my own subject. So that work has been scrubbed, so that's a couple of years' work obviously missing. I did pull out of it a small 9-image piece that I call simply Elegy to Pan. 9 separate frames, but I see them hanging as one. So it's a pretty small effort to come out of 2, nearly 3 years of work. Since then, I've been doing some experimental work earlier this year. Again, I guess it's got to be political, through a strong sense of concern over the Chamberlain case, not from the point of view of who did it, but a point of what is justice, can justice come out of emotion, should media control trials, this sort of thing. There are a whole host of things in there that I would like to make a comment about. That again will be a fair bit of work. By the time I finally pull it into shape, I anticipate that will probably take up the spare time that I have available almost for a year. And yet in the final result, it'll be one framed piece. I'm also doing some experimental work about perception space and so on that may or may not ever be shown. It's part of a learning process for me of understanding the space that I live in. I think a lot of work falls into that category. It's a self-examination that may or may not need an audience. If it needs an audience, I will try and get an audience. If it doesn't, then it won't reach that point.
You've quite often, in recent years, gone away in the bush to make photographs, spent time away from the city. Why has that been? What sort of influence does that have over you? I think I can remember one you said that he wrote letters in the bush, and when you got back you didn't recognise the person?
Yeah. I think that what you can think and what you can explore mentally, emotionally, when you are in isolation, and particularly in a very open environment, and by that I'm speaking about the real Australian bush environment, and that's not trees and mountains, it's vast flat plains with a hemisphere of sky and a hemisphere of flat earth, if in fact you can have a hemisphere of something flat. Somehow place in space has a lot to do with thinking. And I think that what can happen then is if you transfer those thoughts back to a space that is now a ceiling 9 feet above you and walls that you can almost reach out and touch at any one point, and a dead flat floor that has no real relationship to something within you, then what is thought in one place is absurd in the other. I'm not getting into mysticism, but I have noticed it repeatedly that the thoughts that are perfectly clear to me in that isolated environment are a joke when I come into a suburban environment. I even have that situation, I think a lot of people feel it, you can't sleep and you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and pick up a pencil and a pad and you start to jot down a few words, and you find that within an hour before you go back to bed you've written a short poem, and you're quite convinced at the time that it is pure genius. But when you get up in the morning and you read it whilst you're having your Wheaties, you realise it wasn't, or something has changed. Perhaps that isolation of the night hours puts you in contact with something that cannot survive within the hurly-burly of everyday life.
Does that make you question what you found out there?
No, I question what I come back to. I know a lot of people say to me when I am going away, oh, you're running away from it all again. Well, I look at the it all that they're talking about, and it's bitumen roads and fast traffic and tall buildings and a lot of noise and a lot of stink. And it is no contact with anything. You don't even contact your neighbour. But when I'm out in that vast space, I am in contact with just so much more. It is more populated than the city. Instead of getting away from it all, I think I'm getting back to it all, the real it all. that is perhaps part of that landscape in the figure. It's that inner strength, peace, resource, whatever you care to call it.